All right, so it's Heatwave 95. Sandman versus Cactus Jack for the ECW World title. You come out, attack both men, and leave. This would be your last appearance for ECW before heading to WWE.
Correct.
Now, at this time, ECW is really gaining some serious momentum. Why would you decide to leave?
Well, I didn't want to. I was very much in love with being at ECW. After having helped build it and been a part of that, everything was fantastic. There was no desire on my part to leave, but I kept getting contacted by the WWF. I had worked with Jim Ross before and knew him quite well, and he kept calling me and saying, hey, sometimes only opportunity knocks once. In this business, you have to really take advantage and that sort of thing. And, I started like an idiot listening to him and not listening to my own experience in the business. My experience in the business was when you find a place that's home and it's on the grow, stick with it. But I overrode my own thoughts. At the same time, it also, having at that point played the character for a good solid 2 years without patting myself on the back, was probably the hottest heel in the industry in 95. So, I thought to myself, maybe this is the time to capitalize on it for my family's sake. And, I'd never made huge money in wrestling up to that point. You start weighing these things, like I just told my kids, sometimes there's that little voice in the back of your head that says, and every dumb thing I've ever done in my life, and I've done a shitload of dumb things in my life, every time right before I've done them, there's been that little voice that says, hey, dumbass, maybe you shouldn't do this. And you ignore it and you go on, and then you get your like my mother used to say, you skin your knees. Well, I skinned my knees. I overrode my own thought process and my own experience and what my experience in the business had told me. But it seemed at the time the right thing to do, jump, to the higher level. And at that time, I had known quite a few people that had done it to WWF. Ricky Steamboat, Sherry Martel, Rick Rude, Kurt Hennig, Mike and Hegstrom, and Joe Laurinaitis, the Road Warriors. And every one of them, when I talked to them about this, said, that was our thinking too. And when we went up there, we made a boatload of money. So I thought, just sort of pushed my own wrestler's pessimism in the back of my brain and said, no, let's just go ride this thing out and see what it's worth. But it still took multiple trips up there. That voice in my brain was screaming pretty loudly. And there was obvious a reason that I wasn't just signing on the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth trip. A big part of that was my affinity for ECW and the growth that we had seen. And we knew we're still a lot more ahead. On the on the fifth trip, I had said to Vince, that my wife and I shared all decisions on wrestling. My wife didn't give the first damn shit about wrestling, but I used that as like good cop, bad cop. So I can at least put him off one more time and, just feel out the process. And just something in the back of my head didn't feel right. And something in my gut certainly didn't feel right. And on the sixth trip up there, I had told my ex-wife on the trip up, if he asks you any questions, I don't want you to be politically correct. I don't want you to try to find the right words. Look him in the eye and tell him whatever you're thinking. And unbelievably, it was the only time that I can ever remember my relationship with her that she did that. And he, at one point in the meeting, he said, Carla, Troy tells me that you share all decisions on wrestling, and I'm sure you must have some questions. And she looked him right in the eye and she said, my husband's worked for you before. He's worked for WCW twice and the NWA. ECW has been the only company that's fully utilized his talent. Then she lied a bit. She said he teaches school 5 days a week, which he loves. He's making a six-figure income from ECW, working a couple days a week. He's at home in bed with me 5 nights a week. What could you possibly offer my husband to walk away from all that? And he leaned across the table. He doesn't have a desk in his room, in his office. He has a table. That his chair is noticeably about 8 to 12 inches higher than yours, the old power play thing.
Now, this is Vince, right?
Yes, Vince McMahon. He leaned across his table and he patted her hand like a dog. And he said, Carly, you have my word as a gentleman. I'm going to make your husband a very wealthy man. At which point I jumped in and I said, well, I'm sure you and I have different definitions for the phrase wealthy. What are we talking about? And he was very quick. We here in the World Wrestling Federation don't guarantee contracts. And then he went on to say, but it's not uncommon for somebody in the position we're putting you in as lead heel, top heel for the company, to make a base salary of $350,000 to $550,000 a year. And that was right in line with what all those people I had previously mentioned, Steamboat and Sherry Martel and all the rest of them, had told us the same thing. Their first year, that's the kind of money they were making, and then exorbitant numbers on their merchandising. So, that started me believing in what they were saying. And as we'll find out as we dig into this a little bit further, that a few months in, that hadn't quite borne out.
All right, before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to know, who do you tell that you're leaving? Like, who's the first person you tell that you're leaving ECW?
Probably was Francine. I don't remember specifically, but I'm sure Francine, because we've been such professional cohorts in crime, if you will. But at some point, Paul wasn't the first. He was probably the second.
What's Paul's response?
I think he understood, and I think for him, from a creative standpoint, it freed up a top spot. It allowed him then to build somebody else. Paul, I think, is the premier person of our generation as character development. He had a lot of people in line that he was ready to push up there. Raven being one of them. Mikey Whipwreck was getting pushed up the ladder, as was Taz and Tommy Dreamer. So it freed up a top spot. I don't think he was, I know he wasn't angry. His last words to me before I left that night were, the door's always open. I knew that there was no heat in leaving. And I think, Paul, having been around the business, knew that, in this business, you do have to strike when the fire's hot, because how do you know that tomorrow night's match won't be the one where you break your neck?
Now, there aren't really contracts in ECW at this point, are there?
No. I never had a written contract with Paul, something that would come to bite me in the ass later, but I always prided myself on my word. If I give my word to somebody, you can take it to the bank. Paul, the same thing, he told me. And we always did our deals on a handshake. I never had a written document with ECW.
Now, at this point, you're assuming you're going to the WWE as the franchise Shane Douglas, or do you know about the Dean Douglas character already?
No. What was odd about, and probably one of those things that was making me reticent to sign, was, again, as the hottest heel in the industry at the time, I had offered, very unwisely, offered Vince that I would sign over the rights to the franchise character that I owned for the duration of the contract. And thank God he said no, because then that would have tied things up later, as people knew my end came pretty quickly. My desire to leave came pretty quickly. And then that would have all been tied up. So I knew the Dean Douglas thing, but as we'll talk about in this episode, there were multiple things that Vince told me about the character that would not bear out. The things that he had promised me. And one of my favorites, and for all the kids out there listening, when you get the opportunity to have the talk with Vince about possibly going there, when he says to you the following line, I want to give you my personal cell phone number so you can call me anytime, 24 hours a day. If you have any concerns whatsoever, please don't hesitate to call me. We'll handle it immediately. So he gave me his personal cell phone number. The first time I called him to tell him that I had a big concern, which was over that clown costume that they had me in, he said, well, that's what I like, so we're going to keep it. And that's his response to everything when you call about some concern or problem you have. It's just, well, that's the way I like it. So don't fall for the personal cell phone line like I did.
So when do talks with the WWF start? Like couple months before you show up? Or
well in advance of that. I had always had a relationship with Pat Patterson on the phone. Maybe I should rephrase that. I had always had a contact with Pat Patterson because of Dominic DeNucci. Whenever I left WCW in '89, I believe it was, to go to WWF in that first visit, it was because and it was never about a job. I would just call Pat and say, hey, have you seen any of my stuff on TV? And, he'd give me some feedback. And it was just very much like a cordial relationship, so there had always been an open door there, an open avenue for communication with them. And let's face it, at this time in the business, we were all endeavoring to at some point get to the WWF. That was the NFL of our industry.
Still is, pretty much.
Well, for the 1.5 million that still watch.
but it's still at the top of the heap.
Oh, no question about it. And largely because there's been no competition, which seems to be changing here as of late.
Sure does. Now, who reaches out to you first? Is it Pat Patterson that calls you with the idea first, or who calls you?
I can't remember who the first was. I know that Jim Ross played prominently in those early calls, and I think in large part because I'd had a relationship with Jim from the UWF days, from my earliest days of getting a break in the business. I had been around Jim Ross. Jim Ross was well aware of my work and what I was capable of, and I think more importantly, what I had learned while in the UWF. He knew how Bill Watts teaches, not just Bill Watts, but the amazing cadre of incredible talent that was there. The Pez Watleys and Dick Slaters and Dick Murdochs and Eddie Gilberts and Terry Taylors and go down to Buddy Roberts and go down the list of people that were instrumental in teaching me. And so I think he knew at this point, now here's this kid that we've seen go from a snot-nosed kid that didn't know how to lace his boots in the WWF to a guy who can cut these scathing, amazing promos. Clearly a heel. I'm sure they saw it as being, the match made in heaven.
Okay, so you've made your mind up. You are going to leave ECW, head to the WWF, and you have your initial meeting. How does this initial meeting go, and who all's there?
Well, the initial meeting was very odd, and it probably was what lent to me not being trusting of what I was hearing. I walked into the office and was waiting for Vince with his secretary. I can't remember her name, and I apologize for that. Bleach blonde. She had worked at WCW prior to that, and that's how I knew her. Real sweet lady. She said, "Oh, Mr. McMahon's waiting for you. He's so excited you're here." And the door opens, and he comes out of his office. And Vince, for anybody that's ever met him, can attest. He's a very imposing guy, very self-assured, very strong voice, not loud, strong, and carries himself like you would expect. And he came out and he said hello, good morning, and then he proceeded to give some bizarrely specific breakfast order to his secretary.
Bizarrely specific. So what's the order?
It's like egg whites, over well, I think it was, no oil, no butter, wheat toast dry, grapefruit, no cherry on top. It was just a very strange, very specific order. And then he said to me, "Shane, do you want anything?" And I said, "No, I'm good, Vince. I've already had breakfast. Thank you." And he said, "Okay, are you sure?" I said, "No, I'm sure, Vince. Thank you very much." And he gives the order, and we go into his room, into his office. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. We weren't in his office for 90 seconds. And there was a knock on the door, and it was the secretary opening the door, walking in with his breakfast. Dude, she didn't have time to walk down the damn hall or across the hall. She had to have that breakfast under her desk.
She already knew what he wanted.
Well, no, he'd already ordered it and had it sitting there like a prop. Had to be. Because, again, there wasn't time for her to walk across the hall and get it. So, let alone some chef making it somewhere, unless the chef was in the top drawer of his secretary's desk and has the Jetsons button on the wall. Push it and you get what you want. And to this day, I can only imagine why he did that. And the only thing that comes to mind is knowing Vince's ego is that must have been, let me show you how powerful I am. I can order this very specific breakfast and get it in less than 90 seconds. And, just very strange. And, those kind of antics may impress somebody. They don't impress me. I've always considered myself a professional, whether it was in education, whether it was preparing for medical school, whether it was in professional wrestling, a professional relationship. So you pay me, and you have several times at your former business brought me in. I come in, you pay me, I answer the questions that your patrons want answered. It's a business relationship. I don't come in and you pay me and I say, "Okay, thanks, see you later," and walk out. Nor do I sit there and tell your patrons, "Well, that's the dumbest question I've ever heard. Next." That would be unprofessional. So that kind of stuff, Vince, putting on this pageant of how powerful I am, I can get my breakfast lickety split. Well, good for you. I got to make mine whenever I'm at home. So, or wait in the restaurant whenever I'm on the road. But it's one of those things that when you see it in action and you see it being done with you got to scratch your head and say, what the fuck is going on? Why is he doing this? And I also made mention as I sat down in my chair that I noticed his chair noticeably higher. It wasn't like an inch or two higher. It was like 12 inches higher. And I made a joke about my chair. I said, "I think my chair is broke, Vince. Why is yours so much higher than mine?" Just because and those are things called the power position.
What was his response to when you said that?
He just laughed. It's I think he got it that I got it. It was strange. That whole first episode up there was a very strange, bizarre thing of stuff like that. Walking into his office, he's got this gaudy Elvis Presley office. If you've ever been to Graceland, Elvis, I loved his music, but man, he wasn't much of an interior decorator. Vince, the same thing, bright whites and blacks and sharp purples and stuff in his office. Not my kind of taste exactly. Just little things like that you notice. No desk. For such a powerful businessman, you'd expect a big desk in there, right? And there's no desk. It's a table. A higher chair than yours. The breakfast in 90 seconds. Stuff like that are just for me. When I walked in there, I seen this. When I walked away, my takeaway was he's setting me up. He's trying to butter me up, soften me up, something, but he's up to something because all of that shit was fishy as hell.
So who all's there? You got Vince. You got the secretary that brings in the 90-second breakfast, which in my opinion I think is kind of impressive. I'd like to be able to get my breakfast in 90 seconds. But I can understand why you were wondering, what's going on here. Why is he getting his breakfast so quickly? Why did he put this whole thing together just to impress me? But you know what I wonder? What would have happened if you would have ordered something? They couldn't have. Had it. They couldn't have had it ready.
Because I would have gone in and said, like, I just want 2 eggs sunny side up. And it would have thrown the whole thing off because 2 eggs sunny side up take at least a minute and a half, 2 minutes. So it would have thrown Vince way off his game. Or better yet, ordered some like crazy specific thing like he was doing. I want a Western omelet, hold the onions with this and that, but hold that. And
right.
It would have been fun.
So
in hindsight, I would have done that.
So, and now who was there? Just you and him?
I believe the first meeting was he and I think Jim Ross came in a short while after it started. Again, you're talking, God, 25 years ago. So it's, a long time and stuff that I've really put out of my head because it was such an overall negative experience that I hadn't thought much about it. Like we're doing with all these episodes of franchise, the deeper dive, a lot of these stories have been told a million times, but just the surface scratched. And so as I recall in my memory, it was he and I sitting there for a pretty long time. And I think Jim Ross came in and possibly J.J. Dillon. And the only reason I say J.J. Dillon is I remember specifically J.J. being at later meetings. I think after that first one. But I'm pretty sure the majority, because it wasn't a long meeting. It wasn't like I was there for an hour or anything. It was in there for maybe 15, 20 minutes. And, it was just a very quick, hello, how you doing? Looking forward to talking to you, that kind of thing. And I don't think there was anybody in there for the vast majority other than me and Vince.